Welcome everyone to the May 13th City Council work session. As you all know, we have a lot of discussion to have around the multi-unit property tax exemption tonight, so I thought we'd just take one rapid trip around the table for whatever people want to offer for the good of the order and under committee reports. So I would just say that it was interesting and pleasure to welcome the Dalai Lama to Eugene. And I also had the occasion this weekend to be at the opening of the women's shelter at the Mission, and it's a beautiful new facility that can accommodate far more people. So, two good things. Councilor Pryor.
I will just quickly go over the Housing Policy Board. Our last meeting was on May 6th, and a lot of what we're talking about right now is what's happening at the state and the federal level. As you know, funding for low-income housing is very much influenced by what's happening at the federal level. And it's not just the money piece, but also federal legislation, which controls how the money can be expended. And so having John Van Landingham on the Housing Policy Board makes it very good for getting very current and regular updates on what's happening. We also then talked about the homeless one-night count that has just been released by the county and its relationship to housing. And the figures for that show about 1,750 people being counted as homeless last year. I know the number is still kind of in flux in terms of how it finally is, but if that number is to be believed, it actually shows a small decline from the last time it was counted. So we will keep our fingers crossed that we are actually not having as significant a homeless problem as we did have before. We talked a little bit about housing inventory, and then we got an update on lane livability, and I'll leave it at that.
Betty?
Thank you. I also heard the Dalai Lama. I have some announcements. Southeast Neighbors Board is having their, Southeast Neighborhood is having their annual meeting tomorrow night at Spencer Butte School. I won't be able to go because we're having interviews. Next thing, Camas Ridge, there's a meeting about crossing 30th on the 23rd, which I also won't be able to attend because we're having a budget committee meeting. But at any rate, those are two important meetings for people to know about. I attended the Peace March, and Kitty made a nice speech there. I have been talking to some people about our bag problem, plus the paying for paper bags. And I think this point, what I've been hearing, points up that it's really important to hear the negative things about anything. Sometimes people say, don't be negative, don't say what's wrong with it. Well, sometimes there is something wrong that you need to know before you act. And one thing that's wrong with this is that people who are on food stamps sometimes don't have any money with them. And when they're asked to pay for a bag, then the grocer person who sacked up the groceries has to take them all out, and they have to carry them out in their arms. And sometimes if they have several bags, it would be 15 cents, 25 cents. So if you're on WIC, it's different. That money can go for bags, but food stamp money can't. Well, that's something we need to fix, I think. And also some of the people at grocery stores, well, some people thought that they had to turn the money over to the city, but they still think it's a hassle and that people don't like it and that they shouldn't be forced to collect it. That's what some people think, at least. But I think that food stamp thing is a really big problem, because then people are embarrassed and the person telling them doesn't like to embarrass them. And they said that some people put them all their arms in. Somebody took the cart out to the car and shoved everything in the trunk, and then brought the cart back. But it's something we shouldn't be putting people through. So I hope that we can correct that. Thank you.
George?
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I think we need to look at that again and adjust a couple of things. I agree with you, Betty. It's been a while since I've reported on the Metropolitan Wastewater Management Commission, and last Thursday we approved have staff enter into a contract to finish the fourth and final sludge lagoon relining. Probably the most important thing was we directed staff to go ahead and enter into a contract with Lane Forest Products for the harvest of the poplar, the first harvest of the poplar farm. They were the only ones that responded to the RFP. Several firms responded to the request for information, and offered all kinds of good advice and information to the commission. But Lane Forest Products was the only one that responded, so we directed staff to enter into a contractual arrangement with them. They are going to, there's 3 market units. There were 3 different plantings, and so they're starting with market unit 1. And they're going to do 52 acres, or 1/3 of that unit initially. It has to be harvested in its entirety by fall of 2015. So this will be a test. The problem with the idea was to try to get the highest value out of it, which would be saw logs. But there's a kind of a low market demand for poplar saw logs right now. And so they will most likely mostly be chipped, although they're going to use a portion and test the market and have Northwest Hardwoods do some sample milling just to see how that turns out. The problem is that was the first planting, and it was a dry year, and it took them a while to figure out the watering system. So the trees were initially kind of damaged by improper watering schedule. So I toured all 3 market units recently with the commission, and boy, you could see the difference. I mean, market unit number 2 and 3, the diameter of the is like this, and the first one is tiny. So, but they're still expecting on this 1/3 of a unit harvest to perhaps have a net benefit of about $75,000 to the wastewater commission. So that's a little lower than they thought, but it should improve when they get down the road to market unit number 2 and 3, and then when they replant that, the first unit, another problem was they used a wide range of hybrids. There were like 25 or 30 different hybrids. Not all of them performed well, and so they've got it boiled down to the best performing varieties in the other plantings. So eventually that'll be good. The BioCycle farm, 30% of the total load of sludge goes to the farm, and another 10% goes to local farmers who are growing on-food crops. So it's actually a beneficial project.
Greg?
Thanks, Mayor. Just a couple of short things. I don't think I reported on this the last time we had this go around, but I did attend the Gang Summit on the 27th of April. Spent better part of the morning and the early part of the afternoon there. I think that there's going to be an ongoing conversation that needs to continue to get out to our neighborhood councils and other parts of our community in terms of addressing those public safety issues, both on the punitive side as well as the prevention side. And tomorrow I won't be with you for the interviews because I overbooked myself and realized that tomorrow is my daughter's 8th birthday. So I think I better spend a little bit of time with her. But Wednesday we have an Active Bethel Citizens meeting, a long agenda, and we will be having reports on the update from the pesticide spraying and the things that we've worked out with UP and the mayor and Beyond Toxics has really had a real good resolution to that issue. So I appreciate what Union Pacific has done and Beyond Toxics have done around that. And other than that, that's about it.
Okay, Claire?
So the El Rapa board meets this week, so I don't have a thorough update on the work there, but we did have 2 budget committee meetings for that body that were successful, and we approved a budget that I'm assuming will be forwarded to the full board as well. And then over the weekend, I participated in the Police Commission's planning retreat, which was very productive, and I think will bring forward a product for approval by this body that will look different from past work plans. They're really looking more at a process-focused work plan rather than identifying particular policies or items that they're going to take up over the year, and they're actually wanting to present it as a 2-year work plan. And I think they're very motivated to create a work plan that will increase the effectiveness of that body and the relevancy of that body to this council and to the police chief and to the city manager in terms of their advisory role. So it was a very productive meeting. Everyone was pretty astonished at how productive it was and really pleased with the work that they did and the leadership of the chair and vice chair. So that was I was a happy way to spend my Saturday early morning and early afternoon.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I first wanted to say that I had the chance to speak last week to the Good Pasture Island Neighborhood Association, and it was the last meeting of run by their founding president, Charlie Cole, who's stepping down after his term is now complete, after having helped found the brand new neighborhood association. And I just, from my perspective, from the cities, I want to say thank you to him for all the hard work he's done helping organize those folks and working together with the folks when the Cal Young Neighborhood Association split up. He did an awful lot of work. And I want to say congratulations and welcome to the incoming president, Bob Clark, who also sits on our budget committee. I have, since the beginning of the conversation, thought the 5 cents per bag idea was a bad one. I think there were just a couple of my colleagues at the time that thought that was not a wise choice. I'm happy to hear a couple more reconsider or want to talk about that. I don't like surprise things, but I feel as though there's probably a majority of us around the table that would probably like to re-examine that, at least, if not suspend it or suspend the enforcement of it until such a time as we do. I suppose I'll make that motion because I don't know the appropriate way to respond to that in a different way, other than say I think we should work to study that, as Betty and George have suggested, to see if we're going the wrong direction there. So I'll move that we suspend enforcement while we study the effects.
Second.
Enforcement of what?
The 5 cent surcharge per bag on paper bags.
For everybody? For anything?
You can move to direct the manager to bring back an ordinance that would suspend. You have an ordinance on the books that has to be enforced.
That's a more elegant solution, and it gives time for more conversation. Okay. To bring back such a motion for our further consideration.
Well, it'd be bring back an ordinance that would suspend enforcement of that, and we could schedule that for a public hearing, given the notice requirements of the charter.
That's my motion.
And you seconded that, Betty?
Yes.
Okay. Further discussion? Yes.
Well, probably not surprising. I think it's working fairly well, as expected. We did put a 6-month delay in there for people to get used to the idea and work through their inventory, mostly for the folks. When it hit, the Register Guard even said it's mostly working fine. Most of the comments I hear that it's working are very positive. There's some grumbling, but there's always grumbling when there's some change. And I think in 4 to 6 months, or even sooner, we probably won't hear much about it. Specific to the WIC issue, or the food stamps issue, it is illegal and prohibited by federal law to even ask people to stipulate whether or not they're on food stamps, because it's a discrimination issue. And there wasn't a good way for us to deal with that issue in the law, and maybe we can look at it through a different lens, but suspending the entire program over that issue is pretty harsh. I am working with the Northwest Grocers. They have committed to donate a substantial amount of reusable bags, as promised, through Food for Lane County and other entities like WIC and food stamps, to be able to get those bags to the low-income people that need them, so that they can bring those bags to the store with them, so it'll get to the low-income folks. It's not just a free giveaway to everybody. It'll be very targeted to the low-income people that are doing that. So I've been working with the Northwest Grocers on that, and we'll be able to do some of that, I think, in the next couple of weeks. So I won't be supporting the motion.
George Bowling?
Well, I've been opposed to the plastic bag ban from the very start, I think, and
Clarify.
I will vote in favor of the motion. A couple of reasons. One is we're now requiring grocery stores and stores to charge people for a bag that they used to give away for free. And it doesn't make any sense. The other thing is, you know, we go through a lot of paperwork in this job, and I shred a lot of paperwork, and the garbage company requires that your shredded paper be in a plastic bag or a paper bag. So now I've got to go out and spend 5 cents to buy a paper bag to put my shredded paper in. It's, you know, it gets you coming and going either way. So I will be glad to support the motion.
Claire?
I probably will not support the motion. I appreciate Alan clarifying some work that's being done to provide relief for folks who are use SNAP. I'm assuming, I wasn't on the council when this issue came before you all. I would have supported the plastic bag ban, though, I believe. But I'm assuming that there's something about state law in the SNAP program that doesn't allow it to be used for that purpose in the way that the WIC program can allow people to buy their bags on that benefit. So I'm interested in looking at solutions for that particular population and that crunch. I agree that anytime you impose a new rule, and particularly one that costs you 5 cents where you didn't have to pay it before, that has unintended consequences and can annoy people. But I think the annoyance at that level is worth the benefit of reducing the pollution caused by the plastic bags that we are trying to eliminate from our waste system and our streams and rivers and ocean.
I'm willing to support the motion because I see it as just a conversation starter. The way it's been changed to where what we're doing is bringing back an ordinance so that we can talk about it, I'm okay with that. I think revisiting the 5 cents issue is fine, and we can talk about it. But what I don't want to do is to set up a situation where we simply trade one type of waste for another type of waste. The goal was to get people to bring their own bags, and then I think the notion of 5 cents was to try to encourage folks to not just say, oh, forget it, I'll just get it in paper, because then you wind up with a lot of paper. But I'm willing to talk about it. It may be that there's some sort of a solution in hand that we can come up with. So while I'm willing to say bring the revision forward, we can talk about it, doesn't necessarily mean that I'll still want to go there, because my greatest concern is I don't want to get ban plastic bags simply to fill the landfill with paper bags. And so if we can figure out a way to avoid that problem, then I'm happy to take a look at that. But I do know that just some folks are unhappy with the surprise element. But I want to be more fully thoughtful about exactly what to do. So I'm willing to go this far, but I'll look forward to a much more thoughtful conversation.
Greg?
Just my knee-jerk reaction as I go into Albertsons and with a handful of groceries at the check stand, and they say, well, you have your bag, and then I'm thinking, oh my God, I left my bag in the trunk of my car. It's only been 13 days. And, I think that we need to give it, with any new ordinance, law, legislation, give it time to mature, if you will, and to, really look at the total ramifications of what's happening. I'm really concerned with us making a knee-jerk reaction to things that people haven't gotten used to. So it's like with everything else, I've got to recondition myself because, my mother always told me, never leave the store without a bag. So, you make sure you've got your merchandise in the bag. So I'm thinking, well, I've got to get used to this. Let me get used to it. I think that, I think 3 months down the line or 4 months down the line, for us to review the ramifications would be a more prudent strategy than just making a knee-jerk reaction 2 weeks in and saying, this is really, not working from this perspective or that perspective. I don't think we've had the time to really give that any kind of thorough analysis, and I would rather have thorough analysis than, just jumping to conclusions because some people are inconvenienced. And it's an inconvenience, but, it's something I think that we really need to do to preserve our environment.
I just want to add to that I could not agree with Greg more. I think this has hardly had a chance to even, shake a little to see how things will work or not work. I think if you gave it more time, in a few months, you would know this and if there's any other issues that you wanted to look at. But you haven't even had a chance for people to even adjust to it yet. This seems really premature, and if I were outside looking in, I'd wonder about why a council would put something out there, barely get it passed, not give it any time to see how it works, and be talking about changing it already. So, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. To help add more information to the discussion, for me, it's not knee-jerk. The reason for my motion is hearing some of my colleagues with second thoughts about something that I've thought was a bad idea from the beginning. And it's not at all about the plastic bag ban. I understand, although I had some concerns with doing so. I understood the idea of banning plastic bags because of its effect on the environment. I understood that argument, and the folks that were making it very well. Mine was that the 5-cent charge on paper bags isn't about the environment. It's about changing people's behaviors and being overly controlling with the populace in a way that I don't think is our job. And it's a 5-cent grocery tax at a time when the economy's pretty bad and hits low-income people pretty hard. And I don't think we spent enough time in the beginning really understanding how negative some of those effects might be, and Betty has raised some of them. So I'd like us to really make sure that something we've already put in place isn't an extreme detriment for some, especially the most vulnerable.
Actually, I was never really for the 5-cent charge, though I voted for it as part of the package. But to make it compulsory, I think, was wrong. One checkout person told me that she keeps some nickels there of her own and uses them when people can't afford it. But I don't think we should expect people to do that. If they want to charge 5 cents, they can. If they don't, I don't think we should make them.
Alan?
So if you recall, there were two reasons for the 5-cent
No.
fee. One was to incentivize people like the Bottle Bill to bring their reusable bags. And the Bottle Bill, 30 years later, works amazingly well, and people don't even think twice about it. This is exactly the same thing. The second reason was to protect businesses. And there was a substantial cost shift from plastic to paper for grocery stores in the tune of $30,000 to $40,000 a year that they were having to pay, which was unfair. And having a mandatory plastic bag shift to paper bag plus the encouragement of reusable bags shifted a lot of cost to businesses, especially grocery stores, which is why they supported and only supported the reusable bag ordinance if it included a 5-cent fee that was mandatory. So if you want to stick businesses with the cost of doing that, I'm sure they would appreciate hearing from you. That's exactly what's going to happen, because there is a big shift, because a plastic bag costs about a penny and a paper bag costs about 5 to 6 cents. So that was the nature of the 5-cent shift. So that was the rationale behind the 5-cent.
George Brown?
Well, I get the original rationale, but, the reality is businesses, grocery stores in particular, have always given away both types of bags, always. It's just part of their customer service. And what we're talking about is the 5 cents of people using snaps, having to pay the 5 cents, and maybe they don't have the cash. And maybe they don't have cash benefits on their SNAP card. So that, I think, I'd like to see that changed.
All righty, we're going to vote on the motion. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In opposition, 1, 2, 3. It passes. Thank you. All right, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda. Yes.
Turn that.
Pardon?
We used my turn to jump in with that motion.
Oh, sorry
It's
about
Alan's
that.
turn in the rotation.
All right. Alan?
Yeah, I too saw the Dalai Lama, and he was was a very amazing thing to be in his presence, and I thought his message was fantastic. It was great to see him here in Eugene. Speaking to the MWMC Poplar Farm, it's great to see that they finally contracted for that in 2014 to be able to use that, although none of that money actually can come to the city of Eugene because it's all the property of MWMC, so it goes back to MWMC, so it's not money that the city of Eugene will see. But just a reminder that the Poplar Farm was, when they did the study, it was the lowest cost option for dealing with the effluent that they had, and so already saved WMC ratepayers, which is all of us, money, and any revenue we'd make off the Poplar Farm would just be pure gravy. So that's why it's a really, really good project. 2 meetings coming up, Laurel Hill Valley Citizens this Wednesday the 15th at Northwest Youth Corps, 7 p.m., and Sustainability Commission is on Wednesday, the same day. I'll be double booked too, Greg, at 5:30, and I'll be attending both those meetings.
Great. George Polling.
Okay, next week on the 23rd, we have a number of things. One is the Police Awards, which is going to be from 3 to 5 in the afternoon. And then that evening, we have our first Budget Committee meeting at 5:30. Mike and I also have a Northeast Neighborhood Association meeting, which we probably won't be attending, but for the folks that live in the Northeast Neighborhood Association area, you will be having a meeting next Thursday night. Real quick, congratulations goes out to the U of O men's track team for their 7th Pac-10 championship in a row, and the women's track team for their 5th Pac-12 championship in a row, and also to the U of O women's softball team for their first Pac-12 championship. I think these student athletes are doing an exceptionally good job of representing not only the university but our community. One other thing, 8 days left to vote. There's 3 major ballots, so make sure people get their ballots in by 8 o'clock next Tuesday night.
Thank you, George. All right, I think we're ready now to move to our main item of the evening, and that is our MUPT multi-unit property tax exemption program. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'll just turn over to Denny Broad.
Thank you. I guess I would just start with just a brief update on where we are with the schedule on MUPT. Of course, today we're having work session number 2. And what we hope to do today in work session number 3 is to take what we hear today and shape it into some more refined set of MUPT criteria that you can review at the next meeting, which is scheduled, next work session, which is scheduled for May 28th. I would also mention that Councilor Clark has mentioned the idea of a council workshop where we would bring in a panel of stakeholders, experts, to analyze some of the criteria that we're considering. One of the things we could do is on May 22nd split that meeting into a workshop and a work session. I think we have the whole meeting at that point, but that is some feedback that you could give us. We also have a public hearing on the ordinance to extend the MUPT suspension, which is happening on the 28th, actual action on that extension on the 29th, and then June 17th is when we have tentatively scheduled a public hearing on an ordinance for the new MUPT criteria, and then we expect council could take action on June 24th, which would put the new criteria in place by the end of July, which is the council goal at this point. So at the previous work session, we collected your input. We've taken that input and we've attempted to frame some options for you to consider, and those are included in Attachment A in your packet. And what I'd like to do is just review those. As you can see, they're segregated into 3 categories, the first being minimum threshold criteria, and those would be criteria that we define as you must meet in order to be eligible for the tax exemption. The other category is additional public benefit criteria, which could be used to rank, to scale, to create some tiers of eligibility within the program. There's also a couple of other program considerations that were discussed and that probably need to be addressed, and they include the boundary and program volume. In other words, do we want to cap the number of projects or the amount of projects in the program? I would also note that we've attempted to align the criteria with some specific objectives so that those objectives are clearly aligned with Envision Eugene, specifically the pillars and the strategies in implementing Envision Eugene, so that, again, they're clearly aligned with a specific public purpose. So I'm going to start with minimum threshold criteria, and again, I'm just going to quickly go through hitting the high points. Again, these which we would be considered to be criteria that have to be met in order to be eligible. Starting with density, and density really is defined as the number of units needed to be eligible. And in the existing program, we require 5 or more units of new housing units in order to be eligible for the exemption, and that's consistent with the state statute, which also says 5 or more units. We have a couple of options. Option number 1 would be that we just continue using the 5 or more units threshold for density. Option number 2 is kind of a redefine of the eligible density to better reflect our compact urban development objectives. For example, we've used a couple of thresholds. For mixed use, you may consider that, and when we say mixed use, this is actually housing over commercial, that 5 or more units could be considered to be a reasonable threshold to use for mixed use. But for housing only projects, we might want to consider a higher threshold for density, higher than the minimum density that's required by code. And we just use an example, for example, 2 times the minimum density. If 20 units per acre is the minimum density in R3, maybe we would require at least 40 units per acre in order to be considered eligible. Moving on to project need, and what we mean by project need is we need to verify and assure that a project would not be built but for the tax exemption. And we've identified 3 options to consider. One is similar to Portland, and we've talked about that at the last work session, which they have a clawback provision where they cap the rate of return. At the end of the exemption, it's determined if they've exceeded the cap, and if they've exceeded the cap, there's a payment that comes to the city, or may be shared between the developer and the city. There's a couple things to consider in this option. First of all, analyzing a rate of return on a property could be challenging, especially where there's multiple ownership entities, possible multiple properties that are owned by those entities. And again, those might present some challenges. We've just experienced that with the Broadway Place project, where we had a revenue sharing agreement that after they hit a certain target rate of return, then we would get some revenue sharing in that project. And they actually never hit the target rate of return over the 12-year period that we looked at that until the project recently sold. What we learned is that there are many financial variables in a financial statement for a real estate project, so it might be a little bit challenging to really pinpoint whether the reported return meets a certain definition or certain requirement that we have. And secondly, as we talked about last work session, Portland has a cap. It's important to note that they have historically not received any payments under the cap, so it might be realistic to expect that we may never receive any funding for a long time, because especially if this all occurs after the 10-year exemption, there would be no immediate revenue associated with that concept. Option number 2 would be a little bit different in that we would do a review of financial projections up front, potentially using an advisory panel, and their role would be to recommend on individual applications. For example, they could recommend a shorter period of exemption if they concluded that in the later years, for example, the project may not necessarily need the tax exemption in later years. And in such cases, the project could respond to that shorter exemption by adding some program elements that provide public benefit, like open space or a higher level of LEED or affordable housing, and so that they earn their way up to the full exemption. Option number 3 also would be a situation where we collect financial information from the projects, not necessarily with a clawback in mind, but rather really to educate how these projects are performing over time, and really looking at all of those projects on the aggregate. Is this information, again, possibly that information could be reviewed by an advisory panel, and they would make some program-wide recommendations. For example, if the data shows that in certain areas the project returns are strong, maybe we would shift MUPD out of those areas and focus them in other areas that have a greater need. Green building is also, I'm sorry, I'm still on these. Green building is also something that we heard a lot of interest in. There are a couple of options, and they're pretty straightforward. One is you simply meet a standard, a menu of standards, say at the LEED silver kind of level. And there's some variations in option 2 and 3 that we've indicated, which would be whether or not you'd want to make some special provisions for projects that for some reason can't meet that. It's cost prohibitive, for example, or whether you would want to consider green building as maybe not a requirement, but as an additional public benefit that project could provide. Moving on to affordable housing, it's one of the more challenging objectives that we're dealing with because we have a significant need in the community. But the economics of providing affordable housing in Eugene are very challenging. We've identified a few options under this category. The first one would be that simply the MUPTI project is required to make a payment to the city, which is dedicated to an affordable housing fund or emergency shelter program. We previously had this in the MUPTI program. At one time, applicants had to make a payment equal to 10% of their first year of tax exemption that was used for affordable housing. Options 2 and 3 are actually requirements similar to what program does. You could require that a certain number of units are affordable to a certain income threshold. Portland uses 60% median income. A variation of that is we could use a higher threshold other than 60%. We currently have tools available that address kind of the 60% and lower affordable housing need in the community. For example, Westtown on 8th, Aurora projects use some various tools to address that need. There appears to be a gap somewhere, in the 80% median income to 100% median income, and we really don't have tools that address those. So maybe you could consider how MUPTI could somehow address that 80 to 100% median income, where there aren't a whole lot of units being produced in this market. You could also consider a hybrid approach where if you don't provide affordable units, then you would be required to make up a payment. It could be an either-or situation as well. Financial reporting was also something that we heard as a desirable outcome in the program. The three options that we laid out are pretty straightforward. Collect financial statements that are reviewed by staff would be the first option. The second would be collect annual financial statements that are reviewed by a newly created panel. And again, they could interact with those financial statements, produce reports on an annual basis and so forth, like some of the other panels. The Urban Renewal Panel, for example, is used for that purpose. Option 3 would be just a variation of that, and that is there may be some projects that are highly desirable that aren't capable of disclosing financial information because of the nature of the investors that they have in their ownership. And you might consider how can we address those, we shorten the tax exemption, require them to provide some additional public benefits in the project, make payments to the city, et cetera. Neighborhood contact is something we already have in our program. I think that one's pretty straightforward. I think you would probably want us to still keep that as a requirement for projects to go at least contact and have discussions with the neighborhood. The application fee, we also heard the possibility of making some changes with the application fee. I would suggest that we first look at what the new program looks like and then come back once we know more about what is it going to take to monitor and run the program, come back with a more detailed analysis on what those costs are and how we could recover some of those. So the next area is what we call the additional public benefit criteria. Again, these are not necessarily required, but could be used to elevate the tax exemption if projects meet these objectives. Local hiring is one of the things that we heard very strongly at the last meeting. And at this point, we've included this as additional public benefit criteria rather than an absolute requirement, because we would likely be on safer legal grounds if it's not mandated, is what we've heard at this point. But we could talk a little bit more about those options. And there's really two options that we identified. We could be very specific about meeting a certain percentage threshold, for example, greater than 50% local hires. There's some questions that I think need to be answered. Are we talking about the percentage of the number of contracts? Are we talking about the percentage of the dollar volume? Are we talking about the percentage of workers that are actually working on the site? And how do we find local? Is it Eugene Springfield? Is it Oregon? Is it regional? And so forth. Option 2 would simply be that they have to do a local hiring plan as part of their application, and they get some additional consideration if they provide a plan that shows how they're going to address local hiring. Other public benefit criteria that we've identified: housing type. We might want to stress home ownership, the design of the units, more family-size units, 1 and 2 bedroom units, for example, or units that could easily be converted to apartments, traditional apartments, or home ownership units in the future, inclusion of affordable housing. Location might be an important consideration, downtown, whether or not a project's located in an economically disadvantaged area, located near schools and drug groceries and transit, etc. And then project features, whether they include open space, use of high quality materials, how they treat parking, and so forth. The other considerations that were discussed were the project volume. We talked about capping the dollar amount of the exemptions, similar to what Portland has done. That's an option. Talked about a rolling cap, which would basically suspend the program once it reaches a certain volume. We've also suggested that you might consider a unit cap, so that would align our Envision Eugene goals, and if you recall, we have a 1,600 plus multifamily unit need that's expected to be unmet without some form of intervention. So we could somehow use that goal for new multifamily units as a target or a cap in the program. Regarding the boundary, we just have identified 3 options. Of course, one was just maintain the existing downtown plan boundary. The second would be an incremental approach where we may consider some targeted expansions, for example, in Train Song, South Willamette, Walnut Station. And the third would be kind of the Envision Eugene implementation scenario where we really take MUPTI out into corridors, downtown, commercial centers, and really look at all of these areas. And these boundaries are not definitive. They're just used kind of as examples of where we might go. I'd just like to finish by showing you kind of how this might work. And what we've done in this green sheet here is come up with what we call a scorecard, and it's just an example. Part 1 of that on the left there is the minimum criteria, and what we're suggesting there is you must meet all of those at application, and then the column to the right is at project completion. We would actually go back and look at that project and make sure it did meet all of those criteria. And part 2 on the right is additional public benefit criteria, and we've just put some made-up points there, so don't pay too much attention to the points. But the idea, though, is basically kind of in this middle chart here is if you meet the minimum threshold criteria, you get a 5-year exemption. And then you have to meet an array of these other public benefit criteria in order to work your way up to a 10-year exemption as possible. What that really does is provide an opportunity for folks who may only initially qualify for a 5-year exemption to look at what other things they could do in the project to earn their way up to 10 years, which would provide them an incentive to create more public benefit to make a better project. And then the bottom just is kind of an indication of how we would intend to look at the return, what they projected with and without MUPTI, and then actually look at it each year and determine whether they're over or under that cap, so to speak, if we decided to have a cap. And then this would ultimately be a scorecard that we could look at any time to see how the project performed initially and over the long term.
The city manager, what is your goal for this evening?
What our goal is to get as much feedback as possible. We're not expecting you to definitively choose an option, but we would like to get feedback on those that people are comfortable saying that's where their general direction is, because then what we would do is come back next time, narrowing that down, and then actually have you set out some specific options to include into the ordinance.
Like, it might be some easier maybe if you take off the ones that are just totally people aren't interested in, if we can identify some of those. The only thing I'm concerned about, honestly, is if the council decides they want to have a panel to have that discussion, and then I'd like to, if you want to do that, then I'd like to hear how how you want to go about what that would be composed of, so we could hear from everybody. And then thirdly, I'd be worried about how far you get down the road before you hear about the impacts of the options that you're supporting. So I'm trying to see, it's kind of a chicken and egg kind of.
And that's why we're not looking for definitive guidance in each of the options, but it would be great to get a sense of where people are coming at this. Some of these might be significantly easier than others as well, that there's generally an agreement around. They could be green buildings or those kinds of things. And so the more we know that's also helpful for the next conversation.
So I'm wondering, and I'll just listen to what people have to say, but I'm wondering if they want to start with thinking about the minimum threshold and how close that minimum threshold is to what people around the table think should be just a basic before you even consider giving a MUPTI. So just that discussion. And I'll start with Mike, and then it'll be George Brown and Betty Taylor.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate very much your incorporating the panel part that I asked for, and I appreciated the conversation I had with Mike with that today. Gave him some names, and we talked about some people that would make good members of that panel, and I think all of us should have that input from people who are in charge of developing some of these projects, to bankers who have to fund them, and to people who do the real work, to contractors who are involved in day-to-day operations of constructing these things. Everybody understanding the real-world impacts of what we're talking about, and whether it creates a good incentive or a bad one, I think helps us make a better decision. Along those lines, I had a meeting a while back with a group of contractors to talk about some of their concerns around what is my most important facet up on the board, which is percentage of local hiring. Now, I appreciate that you want to make that, because of the trickiness of the legal issues involved, you want to make that more of an incentive than a necessity. I'm much more oriented around the idea of making that a necessity, but thankfully I had a chance to talk with some gentlemen who are pretty smart about how to accomplish that, and in the trades that they work in, and they gave me some ideas. One of those was certified payroll. As you talked about the different elements there are sometimes national companies who may open a local office and say that's a local hire. What these gentlemen were saying was, when you have certified payroll, you have the ability to see each and every person who's working on the project's zip code, and you know exactly what the percentage of local hiring is of the people actually doing the work. And I thought that might be a really, I don't know all of the impacts of requiring certified payroll in order to be able to see that report, but I would like to know the answer to that to see if that's possible as a potential alternative. One of the other things that they mentioned I thought was very interesting is that they really wanted LEED certification as part of this, not for its environmental benefits, although there are those, but because it tends to weed out the guys who do shoddy work, or the guys who are brought in out of town cheap to do the work because they don't know how to do the high quality stuff. So I thought that became very important to me from that perspective of its impact on local hiring. And lastly, we've had some issues with previous projects and previous MUPTI applications that center around some legal questions that I'm less expert on, and I'm going to run out of time, so I'll like another round, but I'll tee it up here. Can somebody explain to me why we don't have a requirement for creating findings of compliance with comp plan like we would with a PUD, or like we would with multiple, zone change, any other sort of thing? Why is it that we don't do that with a MUPTI?
I can answer that now if you like. And probably the best way to answer that is by reading you a part of the LUBA decision. Mr. Conte appealed the council's approval of the MUPTI for Capstone, and LUBA dismissed that appeal, and one of the issues was related to the findings of consistency with the comp plan. And here's what LUBA said. the terms of the state statute, MUPTE statute, suggest that the determination whether the project is or will be in conformance with, quote, all local plans and planning regulations is a broad brush, tentative evaluation rather than a focused determination of whether proposed multifamily development in fact complies with the applicable approval criteria. That more rigorous evaluation will necessarily be conducted during the local government's review of the land use application that actually approves or denies the proposed development. The decision approving or denying the land use application, as opposed to the MUPTE, for multifamily development can be a land use decision or limited land use decision subject to LUBA's jurisdiction. However, the tax exemption decision itself would simply approve or deny the requested tax exemption and would not and could not approve or deny any proposed development of land. So according to LUBA, which is consistent with what we advised you at the time of the capstone MUPTE, is that this is not the time, the tax exemption is not the time to do the detailed analysis of the land use requirements. That comes at the time that the city is approving the development of the project. This is only a financial decision as to whether to grant or deny a tax exemption. And there's more to the decision that if you're interested in a more detailed analysis, I can provide a memo with your next AIS.
I have several follow-ups to that I'll do in my second round.
Yes, you will. George Brown.
Thanks, Mayor. Well, I think the foundation of our new policy should be like Portland Housing Bureau. The bedrock of their whole program is affordability and community benefits. That's why they offer their program. So otherwise, why would you want to grant tax exemptions to anybody if they weren't really providing community benefits and helping people get housing, people that are having a hard time getting decent housing. So I think that should always be in our minds but as we move this discussion forward. And I kind of like this outline here of minimum threshold requirements. We need to hone in a little bit more on those, I think. I think that there should be an application period. I think it should be competitive. I think people should submit by August 15th, and then we would make our decision after the review and meeting and talking about it in December, and that would give the developers plenty of time to make their spring and summer construction plans. I think there should be a yearly cap on the total exemption. Portland, for instance, is at least 4 times our population. They have $1 million cap a year total for all of the exemptions. So I'm wondering, should ours be $500,000 a year, $150,000 a year? We're a quarter the size. Maybe that's going too low. I don't know. But last year, in 2012, Portland approved 8 projects. And that works out to be, on average, for each project, $125,000 tax exemption per year, or, for each project. For instance, had there been 10 approvals, that would have been $100,000 each, because their cap is $1 million. Ours is, we don't have a cap, it's open-ended. As many people want to apply, and that's a lot of foregone revenue, and it adds up pretty quick if you don't have some kind of, boundaries on the thing. Just other things that they allow, and we do too, the exemption on commercial portions, but ours, there again, is open-ended. It's like you want to add commercial, that's fine, you can do that. Theirs, they specify you can add the commercial, but you only get the benefit if there's no competing business within a quarter of a mile, established business. So they're not going to give you a tax exemption to compete with people that are already there paying their full taxes. You don't get it. If you're in, say, like a food desert area, say like Highway 99 maybe, or a train song, yes, you could build a medium-sized grocery store and get the full tax benefit there because of the full exemption, because there's no other place within a quarter, half a mile. I mean, it's probably even a lot farther away than that out in those areas. And I'd like to be in every round, Mayor.
Betty Taylor?
That went fast. Thank you. First, I have some concern about the idea of having a panel simply because we have a timeline, and that would take time, and we all know how long it takes us to discuss something once we start. So we might need an extra meeting if we're going to have a meeting with a panel. But as far as, it's no secret that I don't think we should be giving tax exemptions at all. But I think a minimum thing should be this item of at least 20% should be affordable for people earning 60% of the area median household income. I think that should be an absolute minimum. And a lot of these things are just so easy to do. Our current requirements, of course, anybody could get enough points, and I do think that question, if it happens, I know it's going to happen, I know we're going to continue it, even though I don't want to, but could we say 5 years it would be a maximum exemption time?
Yes. You can limit it to 5 years. You can limit it based on the years. You cannot reduce it from 100% per year. So if you want to limit it to 5 years or 4 years or 7 years,
3 years
you
or
can
something?
do that.
Yeah. Okay, that's all I have right now. Thank you.
Rich Poling?
Yeah, I think the minimum threshold criteria set out is a good starting point, but I think what needs to be remembered in all of those is, I think whatever we end up with, there has to be a certain level of certainty about what to expect. And, for example, in the project need, when you're talking about option 2, there's a lot of, well, if this occurs, this may occur, or if this occurs, then you could do this. So like in the project need, I agree with option number 1, because, I mean, it's pretty certain what you're going to end up having to pay, or how much it's going to come out to. The green building, the LEED certification, I think is a great idea. On option 2, it says with council waiver provision for special cases. Is that going to be discussed what these special cases are, or is it going to be somebody putting in an application saying, well, I have a special case because of this? Or are we going to put something out ahead of time that's going to say, these qualify as special cases? Do we have an idea on that?
The financial disclosure special cases, there are certain kind of large entities, financial institution, insurance company investors that invest in real estate that, through our experience, may have some reservations about providing financial disclosure on projects that they're involved in. So, and there's a reason we're calling them special cases, because they're fairly unique, so I wouldn't anticipate there'd be a lot of them. But if there is a highly desirable project that includes that kind of scenario, really the question is, how do we address those, and what are some of the options, and can we ask for more, basically, in lieu of that reporting?
He's actually talking about the green building. Special cases on the green building, not the financial.
Oh, I'm sorry. The other special case for the green building would be kind of similar. For example, there's a co-housing project proposed or being discussed, and having that project get to LEED, there might be some financial barriers for them to get there, and whether or not we want to make it an absolute requirement or give some flexibility in those cases where maybe they could do something else instead of LEED. So it's just an element of flexibility for those special cases.
Okay. I also like the prior to application on the neighborhood contact, the applicant must solicit comments from affected neighborhood organizations. I think that's highly important. The local hiring, I'm all for local hiring, but I think this is one of our discussions that we're going to have. What is local hiring? I think you were, Denny, you were making reference to, we need to come up with definitions. Is it the number or the amount of payroll or what? But I think I would like to see as many real local people working on these projects. And I think Mike may have come up with the suggestion based on his discussions with folks in the community about the zip codes. I think that's a great idea. I think we need to put our local people in our zip codes to work first. And then, I lost my place here. On the boundary, I am really in favor of aligning the boundary with the Envision Eugene strategies. If this is what we're looking at for the next 20 years on how we want our community to grow, then that's where the emphasis should be placed, and I think that's where something like the MUPTE should be put into. So along the downtown, the key transit corridors, and the core commercial areas, and primarily the key transit corridors, because this is what Envision Eugene is about. So let's carry that one step farther.
Thanks, George. Chris?
Thank you. Great work. Really appreciate what's happened so far. Yeah, just going through this quickly, I think it's just some basic things that I think are really valuable to me. I very much like the idea of third-party verification. I think it's really important, and we've been very successful when we've used third parties, and that body can then be an opportunity for us to have a partnership where we can not only bring the expertise of staff, but also the expertise of other people in the community to review this. It gives it a little of a credibility that I think is really important, so I like that notion. I like the idea of scalability, where you can qualify for different levels depending on what you achieve, whether it's you start out at this level and then through additional you get to others. But I think scalability really gives us some additional flexibility that's very valuable. I'm kind of challenged by the notion of clawbacks. I think they're too difficult to try to get a handle on, but I think we can get at them in other ways in terms of kind of that shared benefit. So I think some of the ideas that you've had that are not necessarily straight clawbacks, but they might be alternative ways to share the benefit are worth pursuing. The notion of affordable housing, I think the option number 2, I like the idea of affordable housing, but I don't want to put so many things in place that it creates an inhibition or a restriction, which gets into another thing about housing type. Sometimes if we talked about, well, we create an exclusion for student housing, I think if you require or you emphasize traditional units, that what you do is you can approve any kind of facility, and then if it doesn't work out as one kind of facility, it can be easily converted. Traditional apartments are extremely flexible. So you're saying, well, we're not restricting it. It could be student housing, but if it's a traditional kind of unit, then that can be converted if the need should arise. I think I would focus on the housing type and not trying to be exclusive. Another one is around local hiring. I, like others have said, am absolutely supportive of the idea of local hiring. We need to take into account, though, there may be situations where either the skill cannot be provided locally or some other factors in place. We just need to be able to recognize how we will deal with that situation. But I like the road we're going down. If it is at all possible, we should encourage local hiring. And then probably my last point would be, I agree with also what's said in terms of boundary. The original boundary to support downtown, I'm really pleased to say we've accomplished. We've done enormously successful things downtown. There's still more to be done, but now I want to start looking more broadly. And so the notion of looking at transit corridors, looking at Envision Eugene areas, I want to start broadening our eye in terms of where we can create that same kind of benefit to the community in other kinds of areas. So those are just some initial things off the top of my head, but you've provided the options you have been really good. It's been very helpful.
Claire?
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I really appreciate the work that you did, and this scorecard example, even if we don't go this route, it really helps to frame how we talk about this. My comments are not in any particular order, so I actually support the idea of a workshop. I think that would be really helpful to someone like myself who's not really versed in a lot of these things, particularly the challenges of putting together financing and how we deal with the local hiring issue. I think that could be valuable, but we would need to be mindful of the time we have. I'm not a fan of tax break programs, but I recognize that this is probably not one we're going to vote out of existence, so I want to see the maximum public benefit. So I agree with Councilor Brown on that, and use this to encourage the density where we've identified that we need it. So I agree with the idea of using it as along the same corridors that we've talked about with Envision Eugene, and then I think it should probably cover both sides of a street and not just end at one point and not address the density that might be wanted on the other side of the street. I like the points idea or options as well. I think if we're going to have this program, having some flexibility in it for folks who are applying so that it actually gets used and it's not so rigid that it's a program that doesn't get used for the purposes that we're trying to use it for. Neighborhood associations, definitely we would want to have them involved in the application process, but neighborhood associations vary across the city in terms of how robust they are, so we may want to explore if there's other ways to enhance that piece. I'd like to learn more about what the issues are with requiring minority or women-owned contractors as a preference. So I'd like more information about that maybe at our next meeting. I would like local hiring to be part of the minimum criteria if we can figure out a way to make that happen. And then any plan for local hiring, or if it was minority or women-owned contract preferences, needs to have a process for reviewing how they complied and some consequences if it's not applied properly. And then in terms of the retail, I absolutely agree with the Portland model. We don't want to just encourage any kind of retail. We'd want to encourage retail that was filling a need that wasn't already met in that particular part of the city. So, access to groceries is a good example. There may be other things. I know, like I've said before, there's no pharmacy downtown. Can't get a prescription filled. So we'd want it to be encouraging retail that didn't compete with existing retail and was getting at something that we are missing.
All right, Greg.
I love the scorecard. It really helps to kind of frame the whole issue and really kind of gives us an idea of the parts of this that kind of fit together. I just got a couple of things. One is the issue of the triple bottom line analysis, and a lot of that is embedded in the scorecard and part of that. But I'd like to see us develop a parallel analysis for triple bottom line. And going back to Councilor Surratt's comments about minority contractors, women contractors in the construction of the project, and one of the things that I kind of have not been able to really call out, other than looking at the affordable housing aspect, is the equity part of the triple bottom line analysis. So I think it would be real helpful if we can see in a parallel context the economic development benefit, which is inherent in the idea of building the project, the environmental piece, which again goes back to the LEED certifications and other things, and then as well as the social equity piece, which goes into the whole issues of transit, multimodal kinds of access, making sure that everything is within a quarter mile of transit stops so people can easily access multiple modes of transportation and travel. And what was the other one I was thinking? This is a minor issue, but I think it's a major issue for a number of people in the community. The issue of lighting, particularly surrounding the project, because a lot of times what we end up having is we have various zones in parts of the city where we have total darkness and we have people walking in darkness, which makes a lot of our citizens vulnerable to attack and being robbed and other things. And so for the public safety issues, I think that we need to have some kind of threshold built in for lighting, so that we can, people are navigating and negotiating the area in the evening hours and the early morning hours.
Alan.
Yeah, I very much appreciate the work and the framework. It's excellent. Most of my questions were actually about how would this get applied and how would it work, and you answered them by the presentation and the scorecard. I like the minimum threshold requirements section as a starter. I like the fact that it scales up as you get more public benefits. The whole point of this for me is to clarify and make clear what the public benefits are we get for this tax exemption, and I think this approach gets us closer to that. I like the PDX model for some things, but I think Portland has a very different market than we do and a different developer group, and not sure that mixed low-income regular housing works. There's actually very few projects in Portland that actually do that, and there are none in Eugene, so I'm not sure it'll actually work. I don't want to set up something that doesn't work, especially when we've got 0 examples of where it actually has worked. And that's why I favored a contribution to Affordable Housing Fund. My problem was with the way that you guys defined it here, which was 10% of the first year's MUPD tax exemption, and if we're a 10-year program, that would only mean that 1% of the MUPD went to affordable housing, and I was thinking a bigger chunk than that, maybe like 10% or 5 to 10% range, because 1% just that's kind of like 1% for the arts. Oh well, sure. And I thought should be more than that. I like, but I don't. I think maybe one way to look at this affordable housing thing is maybe you give a menu approach, and you say you could do an either or, where you can do the mixed housing or you can do this contribution and let the developer choose. I guess the market will then decide which mechanism really works best. And then I like the local hiring. Certified payroll idea is a great one. I like the women and minority-owned contractors as being part of that. I would like to see it if we can't put it into the minimum threshold. Neighborhood contacts is nice, but I don't know that it actually has any impact. It's just kind of a notice thing. Maybe we could think about how to make that have a little bit more impact on the program. The boundary, I think, downtown, Train Song, and then Vision Eugene transportation corridors is what we're talking about. There was an email we got from Mr. Henner, and I talked to him personally, where he was in the boundary, then out of the boundary. Now he's out of the boundary again, and so he wants to get in the boundary. So maybe we can help figure that one out for that particular piece of property when we get to the final boundary setting. And I'll need another round.
I just want to bring up one topic, and that is, I think at other times in the past, we've had conversations about competing businesses and whether competing businesses take away or add to. And in some cases where you have a number of something, it actually adds to a larger whole, adds to the robustness of the area. For example, if I don't think many of us would think a number of restaurants is something that we should be trying to not have. I think we would think that that competition adds to the robustness of our downtown. Likewise, there are many different kinds of stores. There are many different kinds of grocery stores. There are many different kinds of all of those things. So thinking carefully about how much borders we build around that could actually take away from the success of what we're trying to do, I think you'd have to be really, really careful with. Mike, you're next.
Thank you, Mayor. One of the things that impressed me when I spoke with these guys that do this work here a couple weeks ago was when I was talking about wanting to have percentages of local hire. Their real issue wasn't so much that, so much as it was making sure that for the tax dollar we're getting responsible contractors. Now they gave me this, and I read some of it, Building Oregon Responsibly, which was in response to ORS 279, and that's more public contracting issues. But I think that if we had some sort of standards around responsible contractors or some definition of that, that might also help with, if we can't put a firm percentage of local hire, that helps us by default get to local hiring in larger percentage. That makes sense. My issue is about clarity with regard to the legal questions around this. I don't want the city to be sued, and I don't want the city to sue people any more than we absolutely have to. I'd like to minimize that because it's a cost the city doesn't need to spend. And so my thing is, I always think, take all the egos out of this and just talk about the rules, make sure they're clear, transparent, and simple and equal for everybody. So if this is really more about the financial transaction and less about the land use planning part, my question is, how is it that Mr. Conti succeeded previously?
Succeeded in which? So the thing to remember is there were several appeals. Are we talking about Capstone?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so with Capstone, there were several appeals. There was the challenge to the MUPTI approval.
Mm-hmm.
LUBA ruled against him on that. He appealed that to the Court of Appeals, and then when he settled with Capstone, everything that was pending was dismissed. So in terms of the MUPTI appeal, he lost. In terms of the appeal of the alley vacation, there were 3 issues that were raised. He lost 2 of them, won 1 of them. The one that he won was toward the end of the process. The developer decided rather than vacating both the east, west, and north-south alleys,
right,
there would just be one of them that would be vacated.
Mm-hmm.
The argument he made to LUBA that they approved was there should have been an opportunity for people to talk to you at a public hearing about whether that change was significant.
Mm-hmm.
So that issue was remanded back to the council to have another public hearing to deal with that. The third issue related, I think it was to the transportation impact analysis. I think that one was at LUBA when everything got settled.
Okay.
So Mr. Conti doesn't agree with LUBA's decision. That's why he appealed it to the Court of Appeals in terms of the MUPTI approval. The Court of Appeals didn't rule on that issue, but the language that I read from LUBA's decision tells us where LUBA's at. Until the Court of Appeals rules, there probably isn't going to be any more clear guidance than what we have from LUBA, which favors the city. But again, the Court of Appeals hasn't ruled on that.
Why did he sue us?
Why did he sue us? What do you mean?
Why did he appeal?
Because he disagreed with the council's decision to approve Capstone, to approve the MUPTI and the related issues for Capstone.
Do you think it was about the financial incentive or about something else?
I'm not willing to speculate on why somebody decides to challenge one of
Okay.
your or our decisions.
I'm not going to speculate either. But I was hoping you might help me understand this, because what I'd really like us to be able to do is have a good incentive that isn't subject to a lot of community fights all the time. I'd really like us to have clarity and simplicity and something that everybody understands the rules for, that they use the right way and the way it was intended. So one of the pieces here is that I'm hearing you, what LUBA said is, that's fine. The will be language is something that comes in as part of a later process for us to say, yes, we did in fact comply, or there are not findings, but there is compliance with the comp plan. I'm concerned if we don't actually do that work at the end of the day, but say we will do that work, there's a difference there. And I think that if we don't have good processes in place, we're going to subject ourselves to continuing fights over this, and that's my concern as well.
So if I could add one thing, just to make sure that you don't misunderstand me.
Okay.
The council could choose, and you asked this question during Capstone, could you impose as a condition, I think it was as a condition of approval, the lengthy, detailed land use analysis? And the answer is, if you want to add that to the ordinance, you can certainly do that. If you do that, then you give opponents of MUPTIs another tool to challenge your decision with a very, from a developer's point of view, lengthy process that would then go. So the MUPTI approvals, if you told me to, we could figure out a way, I think, to structure your decision-making so that it actually might wind up in front of LUBA with the same sort of lack of clarity we currently have when other things go to LUBA. The rules that the state has in state statute, the LCDC, administrative rules, the statutes, they are not a model of clarity. LUBA's decisions and the Court of Appeals decisions in the land use arena are not models of clarity. If you want to take those rules and say, we want them to apply to a MUPTI approval, I think we can figure out a way to do that. But if your goal is to add clarity as opposed to make it worse, my recommendation is you do not mix the land use process with the MUPTI approval process. You let the land use process go by itself. And to give you sort of an analogy, when we issue building permits, we can issue building permits to build a building right on top of a high-value wetland. That doesn't give anybody the authority to actually go destroy that wetland. They still need to go through another process to get approval to actually fill the wetland. Here, if the council approves the MUPTI, that doesn't mean the person is now able to go and construct the project. They still have to go through the land use process, the building permit process, whatever those other processes are. So your approval of the MUPTI is just to say, if you get through the rest of that and you can actually construct your project, you get the tax exemption.
Okay. Thanks very much.
All right, we've got Claire and Alan and Greg in about 11 minutes.
Thank you for that clarification. That's really helpful, and I appreciate Councilor Clark trying to find ways to keep these decisions from being sued over, but I just don't think that's going to be possible because you can sue about anything you want to. It's up to the judge to take the case. So I just wanted to respond. I really like Councilor Evans' idea of looking at this through a triple bottom line lens. I think that would be very helpful in terms of thinking about what are the public benefits and how are these projects going to benefit our community in the most concrete way and in a way that already aligns with goals that the city has set out there. And I just wanted to say, just because I didn't mention in my first round, I still think these examples of additional public benefit criteria, provision of open space, and then what Councilor Evans talked about, public safety and lighting considerations, additional bike parking, these other things I think are very high-valued things that we would want maybe as part of the scoring. So I wanted to call those out. And then I also support the idea that Councilor Zelinka mentioned of payment into the affordable housing fund that the city can then direct to use where we see a need and where we want to fill gaps, including this piece that Denny mentioned about not having so much 80% of median income affordable housing, where we set that piece and how that fee would be calculated. I'm open to continuing to talk about that, but I like that idea too.
Alan.
Yeah, I too like the idea of the triple bottom line framework. It's a good one. The 3 E's, environment, equity, economics, are all important in this, and it can help us illuminate the public benefits that we get. I like the idea of third-party verification in the financial reporting area. Problem I have with the way that we do it now is we can't really tell until after the fact if we did good or not. Or if, in the end, the financial analysis was accurate, because we can't tell because we don't ask for any data other than the initial application, and then we don't ask for anything after that. So what happens down the road happens down the road, and it's kind of behind the curtain. I don't think we need more to subsidize more student housing per se, but I'm not sure how we get at that. We can't say you cannot build student housing because that would be discriminatory. Maybe a way to get at that is through the housing type, and if you built more traditional units, student housing tends to be units with 5 bedrooms in them or 4, and maybe by limiting that type of housing within a development, you can limit the type of housing that it ends up being. I think I like the idea of a program volume cap, but I'm not sure if it should be an annual cap like what Portland does, or if it should be based on a units cap, because we do have that gap we're trying to fill with Envision Eugene, especially in the transportation corridors. And maybe we can have caps. It doesn't have to be all cookie cutter. It could be different caps and different mechanisms in different areas too. But with regular reporting, we can deal with the amount of the tax exemptions. So maybe if we built into this an annual report that says this is how much is out there in tax exemptions, and this is how many we did this year, and this is the length of them, so you get this rolling on annual report. So right now we don't have that as a regular part of doing all of this. I think that would be a good thing to add to all of this. I think moving us toward getting clearer about the public benefits for the tax exemption rather than the perception that it's just a tax giveaway to developers. So figuring out what we buy and saying this is what we bought. These are the public benefits we got. If we can make that really clear, I think MUPTE becomes a good tool. And things like proximity to transit and lead and all these different minimum thresholds are things that we can point to and say we got that. And because MUPTE is supposed to work so that if we didn't give them, they wouldn't have built it that way. Maybe they would have built it, but it wouldn't have built it just like that.
Greg?
I'd like to look at adding one more piece to the additional public benefit criteria, and that is I think that we need to encourage a developer to establish or develop an urban garden space as part of the development. And the reason why I say that is because there's a lot of interest from a number of people in our community to create urban gardens. And I know in other cities, people have roof gardens. They have different level gardens based on the type of design of the project. And if there's somewhere that a garden space can be built in the footprint, that can be also used for food production as well, because a lot of people want to raise their own vegetables and that kind of thing. And I think that would be a great way for us to really kind of encourage some of our environmental and equity issues around the triple bottom line.
Some of us are weird about
George
it.
Brown?
Thank you. I'd like to go back to the commercial exemption portion in Portland. The reason they do that is because they feel that it's unfair to give an exemption for somebody who's competing in direct competition with a pre-existing business in the same neighborhood. And it is unfair. I'm a businessman. I will tell you that it's grossly unfair. If you're going to do that, you should give a tax exemption to all the businesses in the neighborhood. They will give the exemption if it's in a more isolated, like a food desert. They will give an exemption for housing with a grocery store. Of course, that makes perfect sense. So I want to encourage that. But they just the idea of like, hey, more is better. That really doesn't work. It's just not fair to grant exemptions that way. Special cases, we were talking about earlier, people who don't want to provide the annual financial information, well, they shouldn't apply for the program. If they want to go ahead and build a project, go ahead and build your project, and you don't have to show anybody your financial information. If you want a 10-year tax exemption, you have to show your financial information to get the exemption. There's nothing wrong with that. It works really well in Portland. As far as expanding this, what I had in mind, I'm not even sure we need to continue it downtown. Downtown's is a really good place to invest now. We may want to consider not doing it downtown. I certainly will oppose any attempt to expand it to areas like South Willamette or Coburg Road. Or these are not economically disadvantaged areas. The property owners there are perfectly capable of making their own investment decisions. I mean, just look, they're thriving economic areas. There's plenty of housing. Since I've been on council, there have been 3 apartment complexes built on South Willamette near 24th Street. No tax exemption whatsoever. Nothing. Nada. A couple of years before that, a huge senior housing project was built across from Woodfield Station. Same thing. They received no tax exemption. That the market was there. The people know. What I'm saying is, where an area where we might need this is something like Highway 99 or Train Song. That makes perfect sense to me. And since those are kind of like lower income areas, economically disadvantaged areas, we may want to change the minimum threshold requirements and eliminate the 20% affordable, because I would assume that most of the units will be geared for affordable to begin with. And we may want to eliminate the green requirement, maybe in all the zones. But if we do, I don't think we should give extra points for building green. And that's an option, too. I think it's more important to provide the housing
Thank you, George.
affordable than not.
Mike, you're finish up.
Real quick, one thing, the market isn't amorphous. The market has lots of different factors, and somebody who bought a chunk of land in 1982 for a very small amount of money and somebody who bought a chunk of land last week paid vastly different prices, and one may well need the incentive to be able to do the project and one may well not. I think there are a lot of factors involved, and it's more complex. Secondly, I understand the desire to want to have capacity to analyze financial documents of those who apply for a MUPTI. But I think there is a vast difference between applicants making their financial documents available to the city for analysis or a third party for analysis versus making them public for everyone to see. And I think that is a very bad idea. I think we'll see exactly no one ever use this again the minute we do that. So I would say that being very mindful of exactly how much disclosure is required to us to verify as opposed to the general public as open knowledge is an important criteria for me.
George?
Well, I don't think anybody's suggesting that anybody and his brother gets to look at people's IRS returns every year. It would strictly be an in-house thing, just to verify, if they're going to go over the 10% return on investment. And Portland certainly doesn't do that. In fact, they wouldn't even give me a redacted form of an application. I asked if I could just see a sample, redact the thing, the heck out of it. I just want to see what one looks like. And that's out of bounds. I'd just like to kind of briefly comment on the idea of the panel and the workshop. I don't know, it may have some value, but it just seems like everyone in the community is known for at least 2 months that we've been doing this, more than that actually. And so there have been ample opportunity to testify at a public forum or send us a memo electronically, send us emails, call us on the phone, provide input, and a couple of people have done so. But I just can't see at this late date now that we're kind of like working on the nuts and bolts to try to get one more committee and open it up, and I really don't see the value of that. I think we have enough knowledge and information to proceed on our own. Thank you.
Well, perhaps the best way to see what the will of the council is to send around a sheet, and people will say whether they want it or not, and then we will act accordingly rather than debate it. Let's just see what people's interest is, and then we'll act accordingly, okay?
We can kind of send that out as a poll as part of
Yep.
a work
Yep.
session.
I
So
think
we'll
that would
just
be the
do
best
that.
thing to do.
Good idea.
All right, thank you. Get back. Yeah.
Good idea on the garden space.
Just going to have everybody.
We're
Like
trying
Greg's
to
idea.